Phil McNamara, former Assistant Secretary for Administration at the Department of Transportation, emphasizes that in government, relationships matter more than titles. On this episode of Lessons in Leadership, McNamara shares how he's led large teams, navigated the future of work, and built trust across agencies. In conversation with Shane Canfield, CEO of WAEPA, he offers practical insights on leading with humility, empathy, and clear communication in today's complex federal landscape.
Hello, and welcome to the Lessons in Leadership podcast. I'm your host, Shane Canfield, CEO of WAEPA. Today, I'm joined by Phil McNamara, former Assistant Secretary for Administration at the Department of Transportation, and also former Assistant Secretary for Intergovernmental Affairs at the Department of Homeland Security. Welcome, Phil, and thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much, Shane. Pleasure to be here, and thank you for WAEPA, for feds, by feds. I always love that tagline.
Perfect. We spent a lot of time on that. Yeah. And it's true. We are for feds and created by feds in 1943. You've spent time leading in multiple agencies, including both DHS, DOT. What's something you learned early in your leadership career that carried you over into future positions?
Great question, and let me just maybe before I dive in, let me just for any federal employees listening to this podcast or recent former federal employees, I want to say, I see you, I value you, I thank you for your service on behalf of the American people. I wish things weren't happening the way they are happening now, but just a thank you. So you're right, Shane. I've been fortunate to serve in government twice now, both in the Obama administration for 8 years, as well as in the Biden administration for the last 4 years at DHS, as well as at DOT. And I think if there's one thing that really kind of speaks to leadership philosophy, it's to listen first, right? I think back to onboarding at Homeland Security in 2009, right? I was coming from politics. I was in my mid 30s at that point, and I was new to the federal government. I had done an internship, many years prior, but I was a new Fed, right? And here I was going to manage, a huge team. And, kind of felt a little imposter syndrome, right? Like, oh gosh, can I really do this? I learned you have to listen. You have to listen first. There's always pressure to immediately sort of make your mark. But, I think if you take the time to listen to people, whether that's career staff, whether it's external stakeholders, to partners that, the agencies are working with, build the trust, you will then be set up for sort of longer term success. And, whether it's, responding to, a crisis or just responding to, an employee concern or trying to drive, some sort of, initiative, I think at the end of the day, employees, they want to be seen, they want to be heard, they want to be respected. So I think that it's that foundational lesson. Listen first, lead second, that's shaped my leadership philosophy ever since. And I'll just then quickly tack on two other things. The second thing is just trust your team, right? I started at DOT as the Assistant Secretary for Administration in 2021. I knew how to manage people, I knew how to lead, but I was now suddenly in charge of HR and procurement and security and facilities, and I wasn't necessarily an expert in any of those disciplines. But you know who were? Those dedicated career staff. So you know what? I was there to sort of drive an initiative, but at the same time, just trust them. They're the experts, so trust your team. And the other thing is one last leadership lesson, and I do believe this. I never felt the need to be the smartest person in the room, right? And I think if you assemble smart people around a table, you'll get smart results. So I would say lead with humility as well.
I think it's wonderful you mentioned trust, because that is absolutely critical. Completely relate to that. In your time in government, you've also held multiple different roles where you were managing personnel, as you've been talking, but personnel and HR policies.
Yeah.
And how did those kinds of people-driven positions affect your leadership style?
Good question. I think if anything, the people-driven positions has made me a better communicator. There's just so much information to process, so many moving parts to what we were trying to get done, whether that was at DHS or whether that was at DOT, that I had to be able to express what was going on to employees and leadership in a succinct and explanatory way. And obviously, during my time at DOT, right, the administration passed the largest infrastructure, bill in a generation, right? And a big part of that at DOT was getting that money out the door, right, quickly. But it also meant that, DOT had to, hire thousands of new employees, right? And onboard new employees quickly. And so, here I was, right? I had to learn about all these hiring authorities that we could figure out a way to expedite hiring and meet the demands of what the administration wanted us to get accomplished. And, I couldn't go to Secretary Pete, right, and start talking to him about the intricacies of Title V or OPM regulations for delegated hiring authorities and everything that was entailed there in the same way that I could talk to my HR directors about that, right? So I had to find a way to, get the information to where it needed to be in the form that was most useful to the audience, right? It's sort of like, what is your audience, right? And I think that really helped me cut through what was necessary and what was sort of, fluff, right? I think two other, points, we focused a lot on employee engagement, and I made that kind of a hallmark of my, of my tenure. And coming out from the pandemic and returning to the office, I really wanted to ensure, right? We talked about this all the time, that DOT, remained one of the best places to work in the federal government, and that we were meeting employee needs, right? So employee engagement was constant for us, and I think back to, unfortunately, right, the dysfunction in Congress, meant that agencies, every September and, in the fall go through, lapse planning, in the event of a government shutdown. And I think back to all of the times that, we would be convening folks from across DOT or even at DHS when I was there as well, and to begin the prudent planning, right? To begin the prudent planning of, okay, the October 1st is coming and Congress has failed to, enact an appropriation or pass a CR, right? And I just think you bring an authenticity, especially as a political appointee, right? You bring an authenticity if you can just sit there and say to the career staff, hey guys, I know this sucks, and I know we shouldn't be working on this, right? And I know there are so many other things you should be doing, to fulfill DOT's mission. But unfortunately, we find ourselves in another scenario where we have to refresh our lapse plans. And I think if you bring that authenticity to say, like, this is awful. We would be doing these, and sometimes we'd be in person, sometimes we'd be virtual on Teams, and people would, I look around and everyone's like nodding their head because it's like everyone's thinking it, and I just gave voice to, yeah, this is awful. Why are we doing this, right? Bring in authenticity.
Absolutely, I agree with that completely. And to your other point about, especially as you elevate through leadership roles, it's simply impossible to be a subject matter expert on the wide breadth of topics and challenges that you face. You simply can't do it. So you build a great team, you guide them, coach them, and empower them.
Yeah, and trust them.
And if you trust them, they trust you, and they flourish under that, as anybody would.
I wasn't going to talk about this example, but obviously at DOT, we had an initiative early on, start of 2021, right, with Secretary Pete, where we wanted to be, sort of a model agency in terms of what we were going to do to transition our own vehicle fleet from traditional gas-powered vehicles to electric vehicles, right? And we wanted DOT to be a leader, right? And this all fell under my my purview as the Assistant Secretary for Administration. And I could have been very top-down, heavy-handed with my team and said, like, let's establish these goals and let's do all these metrics. And instead, I just said to them, guys, DOT needs to be a leader, right? We need to be that model agency. Like, if we're going to be encouraging other agencies to use electric vehicles, our own vehicle fleet needs to resemble that, right? And that's all I said to them. And you know what? They ran with it. So that, in the first year of the administration, we placed the largest number of orders for electric vehicles with GSA, right? Like, it was DOT that did it. And so I was proud of my team. And that's all they needed. All they needed was, we want to be, guys, let's go be the leader. And they ran with it.
Was there a time when you had to make a difficult decision as a federal leader? And if you could unpack that a little bit, how did you work through that challenge?
Throughout my career, right, I served for 9 months as the Department of Homeland Security's Chief of Staff. I spent the last 4 years as I mentioned, as the Assistant Secretary for Administration at DOT, and sometimes explaining to people what an Assistant Secretary means is kind of difficult. And for me, and you alluded to it a little bit ago, right? It's as things get elevated up the leadership change, it meant for me the hardest things fell on my desk, right? If something was easy, somebody 4 layers below me would have solved it, right? So things would land on my desk, usually on a Friday afternoon at 4 p.m., right? And expecting me to suddenly be able to resolve the issue, right? And it's thorny and it's complex and it's nuanced. I think, looking back, I think one of the hardest things we dealt with in at DOT, and it directly impacted our workforce, was in 2021 as we were we were all remote. We still had thousands of air traffic controllers that had to report on site because they couldn't land a plane from their home. But for the most part, DOT we were doing this remotely. And so, how were we going to bring employees back to the office in a safe way, right? COVID kind of still, rampant at the time in 21. And, I think that really was a test to, my leadership, how I worked with, the people above me, my secretary who had, his own thoughts, the White House that had its thoughts, as well as then, rank and file employees. And, DOT has a large number of unionized employees too. And, the unions had strong feelings on how we should do this. So I think it really challenged me to think sort of more holistically, realize there's not one, answer. It made me be more flexible. This was something that no one had ever done before, right? We had thousands of employees who now had been, working remotely for 18 months. How were we going to bring them back? We've really relied, and I really relied on, on my team to be my sounding board, to help craft the best approach possible. Where I sat, right, I had the competing demands of balancing the employee concerns with the administration's priority, right? President Biden went before, a joint session of Congress in the State of the Union and said employees would come back to the office, right? So, when I'm working for President Biden, right? So I had to, figure out a way we were going to do this, promoting the message and the value that comes from being in person versus the concerns that employees had about returning to the office after being remote for so long. I had to understand the politics of it all. So I think it was very challenging. Frankly, some days I had to, separate my personal feelings from, those in my professional capacity, because I personally had a viewpoint. I was recognizing that it's a cliche for, some people to say, but I believe this, that, employees and people are an agency, a company, an organization's most valuable asset, right? And so, I was deeply committed to ensuring that we did this in a way that was sort of very employee-centered. We had some setbacks along the way, new variants would pop up. And then, I think we finally got folks back in early calendar year 2022. we hit a rhythm, and then, fast forward to, summer of 2023, the White House again asked us to do more. So, we had to go through, this return to the office 2.0, as I called it, because we had done 1.0 back in 22. So that, I think, was one of the hardest challenges we solved. And, fast forward now to, 2025 with, the Trump administration and just, a full-fledged 5 days a week back in the office. I don't know if anyone's really figured out the magic sauce on this, but, and I think, whether it's the federal government or the private sector, everyone's still grappling with that question of, remote, hybrid, all the rest.
Yeah. It's really interesting to listen to you tell that story that way because, we're a nonprofit, we're a benefits trust. We only serve the federal government, but we're not a government agency. And so even though we had this same kind of thing to, evaluate, do we bring people back? How do we do it? What are the issues? The piece we did not have was what you talked about with President Biden making a statement before a joint session of Congress. That dynamic does not exist in the private sector.
Yeah,
so,
right.
I can only imagine how complicated
it was. It was complicated. That's a great word and an understatement.
Yeah. If you were to go back to the start of your career, what's one piece of advice that you would give yourself now?
Two things. The first is really easy, and the second is just a constant reminder. The first that's really easy is just to take a long view, right? Which is that, you can get so wrapped up in whatever you're dealing with in the here and now, in that day, and then just kind of take a step back and say, will any of that really matter in 5 months or 5 years? And if and if it matters in 5 years, okay, yeah, invest the time and the, emotional energy into it. And I think the other thing that just, I would tell myself, and a constant reminder is, people will say, oh, will you meet with this, young person who's just graduating college and looking for a job, or will you meet with this intern who's down in DC for the summer? And I always say yes. No matter how busy my calendar is, I will always say yes. And what I always tell interns and folks starting out, early in their career here in DC is relationships matter more than titles. And, early on, right, you're running this rat race and you're trying to, climb the ladder and get to that next rung and, chase the next, cool job title. But, I think what truly propels someone's career and what sustains them, right, is the network of people, the colleagues, the mentors, the collaborators you build, along the way, and the people you work with, right, today may become your partners down the road, right? I still think back to, I moved to DC in 1998, and, I met people in 98, 99 that, are still mentors to me 26, 27 years later. So, relationships matter, invest in those relationships, treat everyone, right, with respect regardless of their position, right? Back in the day, right, you used to walk into an office and the first person you see is at the front desk is usually a receptionist. Treat that receptionist the same way you're going to treat Shane Canfield, the CEO, right? You have to show up with respect, shared values, mutual trust. But I'd say invest in relationships is just the constant reminder.
Who is one person, it can be somebody you know personally or somebody well-known, who has impacted your leadership style?
Look, at this point, I've been fortunate, right? I've now worked at this point for, 5 different chairs of the Democratic National Committee. I worked for 3 different cabinet secretaries, all prominent people, right? I worked for Howard Dean and Terry McAuliffe and Janet Napolitano and Pete Buttigieg, prominent politicians in their own right. So, you're not gonna get me to pick my favorite. But, one thing I will say I took away from my most recent boss, Secretary Pete, was just a reminder why we're doing the work we're doing, right? In particular, I think in the federal government, and, it's so easy, right, to talk in either jargon, acronyms. And so, I mentioned earlier the infrastructure law. And, so for instance, there's a brand new grant program in the infrastructure law called the Bridge Investment Program. And it was, I think, $15 billion over 5 years to, essentially repair, rehabilitate poor or at risk of being poor, failing bridges across the country. In the federal government, we can talk about it as the Bridge Investment Program and $15 billion, right? And, we'll call it the BIP. I think what Secretary Pete always challenged us to do is talk about that in ways that average Americans would understand, right? And so what average Americans understand is if they have a bridge in their community and that bridge is frequently having, detours or lanes of the bridge have to be sort of, taken out of service and that causes delays, well, we can talk about the investment we're making and we're going to repair that bridge and it's going to be more safe and it's going to reduce delays or detours and it's going to save you time on your commute. If we can talk about that in terms of what, is actually impacting that, that American, that's far different than talking about a $15 billion bridge investment program, right? Anytime he would always challenge us just to, constantly make the work we're doing matter to the American people. And so, that, I think that's something that has, definitely impacted me and I'm still kind of, grappling with, as I think about, okay, we're going to design a new personnel policy. Okay, let's think about the impact that that's going to have on the employees. So that's something that I take with me.
So I live north of D.C. and go over, it looks like an old bridge at Point of Rocks, metal lattice bridge over the Potomac. And now you have me thinking, maybe... Is it still working?
Yeah.
Because you're right. That gets people's attention. Yeah. You certainly got mine just listening to you.
Yeah. Or obviously the most famous bridge, right? Everyone talks about here in the region is the American Legion Bridge, right? Sure. Over the Beltway. But that, right? Whether it's the bridge you're familiar with or the American Legion, like these are lifelines. And so, the investments that the government's making, and just don't talk about them as the Bridge Investment Program. No one knows what the Bridge Investment Program is, except for the dedicated employees of the Federal Highway Administration who are administering the Bridge Investment Program. They know what it is. But to an average American, they just want their bridge to be open and safe and be able to cross it and not have delays and detours and all the rest. So,
well, this has been absolutely wonderful, Phil. Thank you so much for your time. And thanks to everybody for tuning in. This is Shane Canfield, CEO of WAEPA, reminding you to empower your team and embrace challenges. Until next time on Lessons in Leadership.
Find the full podcast and future episodes of Lessons in Leadership on the Federal News Network app and anywhere you enjoy your podcasts.